Well, that's what we're hoping, is to get out of here on time. You know, our focus in the House has been good communication with the Majority Coalition. We feel like we need the negotiators in the room. Been trying to have Gary and Andy get some work done on the operating budget. As they make progress, we get the capital budget people in there, and our focus is to get as much done now as we can. You know, any of the sideline things, we've got other financial groups put together this week that are meeting. Let's wrap up as much of the details as we can right now, and then if we have a breakthrough, which I hope is today, you know, to get things moving, we've got as much of the sideline stuff done as can be ready now, and be prepared to finish it.
And over in the Senate, I believe we're in pretty good shape. We've passed almost all of the significant bills that are NTIB, are necessary to implement the budget. We're down to a very small number. I don't anticipate problems with those. When Senator Hargrove is a sponsor, it helps bring votes, for example. So we're in pretty good shape getting those out, that we could wrap up a budget in a timely manner and stick to Andy's original goal for 21, 10, and 105. So that's where the Senate is from a 30,000-foot elevation.
And, you know, having done a budget before, you always hear, well, we need 10 days or we need X amount of days. This place is amazing in the miracles that can transpire if everybody gets together and we can get a framework. So that's where we're trying to do from our end. I think we have a logical pathway, but, you know, we need to have some of those larger framework discussions and agreements here shortly, and then you can kind of, once you get the big rocks figured out, you can start to fill in, you know, the pebbles and the fine details. But I think there is a pathway to get home, and Mark and I met with the governor this morning. I think we're all committed to, you know, doing what we can to get out of here in 105 days, but more importantly, get out of here in 105 days with a budget that works for all of Washington, our taxpayers, our employers, and, you know, everybody out there that has a stake in this. And so that's our goal.
Just to be relentless on the same subject, the 0, 4, 21, 105 days, our goal is to get out on 105 days. And if there's a will to do that, then you stay and you work late into the early mornings. We've done that before. We put together a capital budget overnight 2 years ago. I was there. In the past, our governor was very helpful in saying, what were the issues? Where could we come together? I have to give credit to Christine Gregoire for focusing on those bills necessary to implement the budget in the past and find common ground. I hope that we can do that in the next few days. Again, if there's a will, there's a way.
And I'll just say that having carpooled with Linda, you know, as I head up to Seattle, and sometimes I drop her off at SeaTac, I can guarantee you on every one of those trips, whether it's been up to SeaTac or back down from SeaTac, she has reminded me that you better get us out of here in 105 days. So we are very committed to that goal.
I think it's a good sign, too, that we're seeing the tax package. You know, the Democrats have passed their budget. The question is how do you fund it, you know? So that's another piece of the puzzle that has to be on the table. It's pretty hard to negotiate when you don't know how they're going to fund, you know, what they want. And we'll see the tax package today. And I think that coming in lends itself to the size of the box a little bit and how things are funded. So I'm hopeful that that's going to be a necessary part, you know, passing the tax bills this afternoon, and then we can get down to negotiations knowing what's on the table.
So just to be clear, are you saying that you think a final package deal can be done by Sunday, or just that you would be done with your budget?
No, we're
First of all, it's not getting done with our budget, it's getting done with the budget. It is still very much within the mechanics of the institution to finish on Sunday. This is my 21st session. It can come together, and the time is still here for the mechanics to work.
And when
are you holding your breath?
You know, I'm a farmer. I have to be an optimist. It's always going to be better. The next day will bring the sunshine or the rain we need, so I'm an optimist.
when the governor says he wants to talk about gun violence reduction measures, I think he specifically talked about the background bill, the abortion insurance coverage, RPA measure, DREAM Act, transportation funding package, all have to be part of the mix.
No, I mean, our conversations with the governor have been almost exclusively focused recently on the budget. The governor would like to have a transportation package. I think there's interest in it, but our conversations with the governor have been first and foremost focused on the budget in recent meetings, as it should be. We're past cutoff. Our work now is to pass a budget for the people of the state of Washington that is sustainable for 4 years.
So is the transportation budget, what are the chances of having a transportation budget by Sunday? Reading in between the lines that it doesn't look like it's likely.
Well, there's two elements there. There's the transportation budget, which I think is very likely. You have the transportation package, which is a separate element, so sometimes those get confused. Again, it's one of those, if there's a will, there's a way. We have been very clear to the governor in all of our conversations that, one, we're going to need some reforms before revenue, and then also that we're going to need the CRC disconnected in any transportation package to get it through the Senate.
Okay, both sides are stockpiling up. I'm calling them hostage bills. The Senate bills are not getting through the House. House bills not getting through the Senate. Are all these now dead, or are they still on the table? And how can you get all that done by Sunday?
Log jams can routinely be broken here. We've seen it before. We could see it again. That lots of things can start moving. I've seen 20 previous sessions that things can and do move when the will is there.
Senator Tom, you're the designated education guy at this table. I've just declared that.
Okay.
Because Steve isn't here. Levy issues.
Right.
You guys started to touch on that a little bit this week with dealing with the grandfather districts and others.
Right.
A, isn't that a significant part of the Cleary puzzle? B, is it something you guys want to do something with this year, or are you with your governor who says it's too much heavy lifting this year and it'll have to be done later?
Well, we passed it off the Senate floor yesterday, I believe, as far as bringing it down from the temporary bump that we had from 24 to 28, and also dealing with the levy equalization factor. One of the things that's really important, and we're really trying to approach this in a sustainable long-term mechanism, and making sure that we don't have fiscal cliffs, whether that's in education or in other areas of government. And with that levy, bringing that down so that, magically we don't come out to 2018 and say, okay, all of a sudden we're going to cut 4% from your levy. The key in this has just been my experience in education, nobody can be a loser in education. And this year, when we have those additional dollars, from the Senate side, we're putting in $1.5 billion in new dollars to our education K-12 system. When you have that, you can start to make a much more rational system. And that's what we're trying to do from the Senate side, is make sure that we're data-driven, it's rational, we're evidence-based, and how you do that, obviously, anytime you're trying to change the status quo, there's winners and losers. But what we can do with additional dollars, because everybody's getting some, now some are going to get less than others, but it's important that we move to a system that is rational, that's based upon student outcomes, so that we can get the growth factors that we're investing in. Otherwise, if all you're doing is maintaining the status quo and putting in dollars, we've seen over the last 8 years, what does that get you? It gets you flat gross in graduation. It gets you, in Washington State, we're one of only 2 states that's actually seen a reduction in the achievement gap. And that's the other message as far as, when John talked about bills, we've been very adamant that, when it comes to education, the reforms have to go with the funding. Because if you just have one, you're not going to get the results. And my biggest nightmare is you put all of this money into McCleary, and 5 or 6 years from now, you know, our graduation rates are still flat. We haven't seen, if we've seen improvements, you know, maybe we go from 77 to 79. Well, is anybody going to be real excited 6 years from now if we're still below 80% in graduation rates? No. So we need to make fundamental changes, and that's why I think it's important with those dollars, coupled with the reforms, we actually can make a difference for our students.
If that intention, let me finish. Yeah. The intention of the MCC is to have some levy aspect in this package by the end of this session. Is that one of the reforms that you think needs to be there, or are you willing to, I know you have a bill, but how important is that bill to the MCC as far as
it's critical, or else, you know, truth in lending, I don't think there's anybody in this room that thinks that, you know, we're going to get out to 2018 and be able to take a 4% drop in levies. So I mean,
so levies on the table for the rest of the session.
Correct. I mean, we have to get where we have we've talked about from the very first day a sustainable budget. And you cannot have sustainability if you have fiscal cliffs. And whether it's in the hospital safety net or in levy funding, we have tried to make sure that we have glide paths on these things. So realistically, we can look people in the eye and say that we do have a sustainable format.
Well, and let's be clear on the levy on the levy thing. It's a very modest proposal that we ramp down our levy limit. And you realize when we drive more dollars into the schools, that actually raises their levy capacity. And essentially what we're saying is we're driving more dollars into the school. We're gonna kind of keep that levy capacity about the same. It's plus or minus, but every school district is a winner. They get more net dollars. And again, we're trying to get to the point where we're not continuing to increase that levy capacity, because one of the things that McCleary said was, you guys are relying too much on your local levy dollars. And so this is simply to try and tamp it down and also do this easy ramp down so we don't have that fiscal cliff.
But it doesn't deal with inequities district by district with that bill.
I'm not sure I understand your
You're still going to have wealthy levy districts and poor levy districts, regardless of what you might do with levy equalization. You're not addressing the bigger picture, which is to say that the wealthy districts, everybody has to come down to some level so that the levies are equally productive to some degree district by district.
Right, and that's why the Senate has a proviso in there as far as the University of Washington looking at our salary schedule, because there's a lot of, right now, basically we have a single factor salary schedule that, you know, is based upon, you know, how long you've been here and if you have masters, or, you know, where you are on the education spectrum. And what we're trying to do is go to a multi-tier where you have factors that actually influence student growth. And those are, you know, you're going to have performance, specialties, and other areas. Coupled with that, you have to have discussions as far as cost of living factors, because right now, the de facto reason why you see some of those higher levy lids, quite frankly, is because you have cost of living differentials that are real, and in order to have the quality of teachers. So that is a discussion that we're preparing for, and knowing that McCleary is a 6-year process, we want to start making sure that, you know, we're taking care of some of these things, just like when we looked at, you know, how are we going to spend the money in that first couple years, making sure that we have the flexibility. And that's why we chose, you know, books and buses, because with the MSOC and with transportation, that gives the districts that were using those local dollars for those elements to then decide what is the best use of those dollars to increase.
Again, just use the work of the technical task force on compensation that met for a year and came up with something that sounds almost exactly like what you just described.
Well, I think, you know, if you look at the technical, and others can jump in, if you look at some of that work, you also have to remember that, you know, any work group or the product of that work group a lot of times is preordained by the makeup of the group. And if you look up, you know, if you look at that group, I don't see any taxpayer concerns in that group. It's really strong advocates that, okay, you give me $1 billion and I'll give you $1 billion and let's give. No, it's a lot of work. Correct, but we need to make sure that we're doing that in a manner where you don't have kids around the Christmas tree asking, you know, what do you want, what do you want, what do you want, and everybody says yes, and the only person that's not at the table is the taxpayer that's going to be footing this. We can do this where we get to where we want to be with student growth and student outcomes, but we can also do it in a manner that we can do it where the taxpayer is protected.
To the 2 cent leaders, you talk about breakthroughs and log jams that could be sort of you know, freed up. The Senate wants no new revenue. The House is poised to do what, 900 million. What breakthrough would bridge that in the next day or two?
Well, and Andy can address this also, but, you know, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, originally they were at 1.3, okay? And now you see a little whittling. And then you also have to remember, I think they have 240 million in, you know, the rainy day fund that I don't think Joel's jumping up and down saying, oh yeah, let's open up our rainy day fund. So, I mean, there's a lot of numbers that are missing in their budget, and that's why we wanted to make sure from the Senate standpoint, you know, our budget is complete and it's a package. And once everybody has, you know, it's one thing to negotiate on, you know, these esoteric matters that, you know, oh yeah, let's talk about $2 billion in new revenue. Well, show me where you can actually get in your caucus and in your body. We've shown you what we can do in the Senate as far as coming together with a bipartisan budget that is $1 billion in new McCleary money, $1.5 billion in K through 12 dollars, and no new revenue. Show us what you can do, and then when we have real budgets, we can start to then negotiate.
Follow up on his question. Got Rodney correction. I got Ross Hunter saying on the rainy day fund, he wants to have negotiations first before they go for a House vote on the rainy day fund transfer. What's your side's view of that? He wants negotiations first, and then the rainy day fund transfer done.
I think
done second.
Representative Hunter would have to show everybody here what he wouldn't pay for when he doesn't get that vote from the rainy day fund. And then Representative Hunter has to show the House and the Senate the tax bill whittled down, what it buys, and, by the way, does it still balance with all that spending for 4 years? Because that's the law. It has to balance for 4 years. We were very careful, John. I was so proud of Andy and Hargrove that our budget shows nearly $1.5 billion at the end of 4 years. That's the sustainability that I'm very proud of the work of Jim Hargrove and Andy Hill.
Okay. Is the breakthrough you guys moving, or is it the House continuing to get to zero revenue?
The House has to pass their bills necessary to implement the budget. Otherwise, we're negotiating with ourselves.
But they seem poised to do what, 900 million based on the committee vote.
We're just focusing on what we need to do in the Senate, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see what they do. Our goal is to pass bills necessary to implement the budget. That's the total picture. That's what you always have to do when you pass a budget. So they're a little behind. If they want to get caught up to pass the bills necessary to implement the budget, they can do that.
Okay, so
but negotiating from 900 minus 240, okay, versus negotiating from 1.3 or 1.4 is a very, and that's why we're saying, you know, we got our job done, you guys get your job done, and show us really where we're at, because we're not going to negotiate with ourselves.
Okay, if I can get you to react to what the average person is seeing here. They see special sessions routinely now. They know they're expensive. How do you justify it?
Well, let's look at balancing a budget for 4 years is probably a greater benefit than what would be spent on a special session. Getting it right so we're not back here could justify it. We don't want a special session. We've been very clear about that. that we want to focus on that budget and getting done in 105 days.
Let's be clear too, when it comes, if I may, when it comes to special sessions, let's remember one thing that I think is critical. Over the last few years, we've had, I believe, 6 special sessions. This is my 11th year down here. I'd love, my family would love for me to come home on time. It was very different though, however, the last few years as compared to this year. This year, there is a different coalition. There is a checks and balances system that is in place down here, is what we're referring to it as. In previous years, you had one party in control of the House, one party in control of the Senate, and you had one party, same party, in the governor's office, and still special sessions. It was not this coalition that was holding it up. It was even amongst the Senate, the House, and the governor's office, one party that was log jammed. And so I think part of the discussion that we have not had here is why has there been a history of log jams down here when supposedly you had one party control? We now have, for the first time in 11 years, we've got what I believe is a checks and balances system in place where you truly have a budget that's been passed out, 30 votes out of the Senate, that's a bipartisan vote, and you still have one person from one party in the Speaker's office that seems to be where the log jam is at. You know, we've got a $900 million tax vote that's supposed to be taken today, sometime this afternoon. We'll see. We'll see what ends up happening. You know, they've got a capital budget that they want to be able to pass. The problem is they haven't showed us a budget that pays for the capital budget. They haven't showed us an operating budget that pays for the bonds. And so at some point, the House right now, the House Majority Party has not put themselves in a position of even being able to negotiate on the budget because they have not passed out the capital budget. They have not passed out an operating budget, unlike what's happened in the Senate. So there's a lot of unknowns here as to what we're going to be dealing with when the House Majority Party, the Democrat Party, has not passed out anything to negotiate at this point. And so I think that that's a critical thing that we need to look at as well.
What's the mechanics then for moving forward? As I understand it, the first House Democrat, Senate Republican budget meeting was this morning.
No, there have been a handful of budget meetings. We met last week with the governor. We met Monday night with the governor.
But I mean, Hunter and you, right?
I was not in that meeting. They talked about education. They said education's one of the big chunks. Let's get the people together. And while we may not be able to talk about how much we're going to spend on education, we can't talk about the size of that box because we don't know yet. We can talk about how we might move things around in that box. We might talk about some of the policy bills that we would want there. But in terms of, I mean, we've been meeting, but to a large degree, it's very hard to have those high-level framework discussions. What's the amount we're going to spend until everybody has fully cooked budgets? And I think it sounds like this afternoon, the House is going to be very close to that. We'll have a much better feeling for what they think they can do with revenue. The Senate is wrapping up. We've done most of our big bills, so we have a pretty good idea of where we are. One thing that's going to make the negotiations interesting is the House budget was down partisan lines. The Senate budget had 9 Democrats and 21 Republicans. It's a pretty strong signal that there are a lot of people from both sides of the aisle in the Senate that support the fundamental framework of the Senate budget.
Okay, but on the education, that complicated education bill from yesterday where you were shifting all the funds, it was 25-23, and you lost 5 of the Democrats who voted for your budget with qualms. They were saying yuck big time to how you were moving your funds around. So that's, I'm challenging you on the signal, being a clear signal there.
Well, again, fundamental overall budget framework, great bipartisan support, some of the underlying stuff, and you'll see this in the end game. We see it every time at the end of the day. You'll have a handful of bills that are needed to implement the budget, and one of them will have a vast majority of Republicans and a handful of Democrats, and the other one will have exactly the opposite. And that's the way you put one of these things together.
My question earlier about the list of non-budget related bills that the governor today said need to be part of a final go-home package in his mind. How does that affect budget negotiations if he's saying he needs these other issues?
So I've met with the governor twice, the governor's office 3 times in the last probably week and a half, and none of those were mentioned. And specifically talked about what the governor's priorities were in the final budget, and none of those, RPA, DREAM Act, guns were not discussed. So that's news to me.
If he's saying it publicly this morning, does it complicate your job?
The last thing I want to do is negotiate in the press. I look forward to working, talking to him, working with him, and seeing what's going on.
And to be clear, are you saying
that basically, from my standpoint, as much as I want to get out here in 105 days, and I probably have more incentive than anybody at the table, basically, the issue here to me is I'm more concerned about our ability to get things done in the next few days than I have been previously, for one basic reason. And Senator Parlett introduced that issue here in her first remarks. The key in previous negotiations where we've had this kind of separation is for the governor's office to be an integral part of that negotiation and to look at all sides and to try to find some compromise situation which reflects his or her priority, but also tries to bring together the results to a point where we can have a vote that represents the interests of all the parties. I don't see that, and I mentioned that to the governor. Even though he's new, his budget director is not new, and yet he's not at the tables in these negotiations. And so I'm very concerned that, from my standpoint, when they vote this $900 million in today on their tax package, we'll be further apart, not closer apart, to coming up with a negotiated resolution.
If you recall, last year, Senator Hewitt was not here for the final couple of weeks of session due to illness, so I stepped in as leader. And at this stage of the session last year, the governor would have been right there. She brought us into her chambers. Actually, it was during the special session, but she was an integral part of helping us get out of here on time. And new bills on the sideline that weren't related to the budget were not brought up. When there was a special session, it was very clear what we would talk about. And they weren't policy bills that were controversial that had already been dealt with. We were focused on bills necessary to implement the budget. And that's a big difference.
And just to be clear, like the workers' compensation measures that you guys passed that didn't pass the House, are you basically saying, yeah, those died, they didn't have the support, or are they part of the mix?
Well, I think there's a whole host of reforms that are education that Pete and others talked about, job creators for the economy, and then budget solutions as well. Workers' comp can have a very positive effect on the state's economy, and so of course it's something that we're going to talk about.
But I would remind everybody that in the last 2 years, we had a lot of policy issues, and not all of them got resolved in the first session, the long session. Some of them got resolved in the second session, like the 4-year balanced budget. That was resolved in the second session. So they're all important, and whatever ends up in the end, it's hard to say. They're all on our list.
But it sounds like you won't be able to get out of here on Sunday if the governor is playing such a backseat role.
It is our job to present a unified budget to the governor. The governor can veto it, he can accept it. If he chooses not to help us get to a balanced budget, that's his choice. Our former governor was very helpful in doing that. This governor, in the end, can vote yes, vote no, veto parts or whatever. If he doesn't want to help us get to solutions, so be it. I can't speak for him. I'm just telling you what the previous governor did at this stage of a session.
So you're saying he's not helping you get to a balanced budget at this point?
He's not as active as his predecessor.
But I think we all want to get there. And I think, people have different priorities. That's part of the negotiating session. I think that I've had a number of discussions with the governor. The governor's office has been pretty clear what his priorities are. Those sideline bills are news to me that I heard that. I'm hoping that it's out of context or a separate issue.
Should the governor be giving you ideas to bridge the gap between the House and the Senate, and is he doing that in terms of budget?
finding new ways to find the money that's found in different ways in the House.
I haven't seen that, but I do know that they're looking for ways. I've talked with the governor's office, and they're kind of looking for ways. Well, what if we did this? What if we started with an open negotiation like this? I think there's a desire to get things done, but I think that it is a different dynamic than in the past. As Representative Christensen said, it's different than in the past. We do have, two budgets that are this far apart, as opposed to in the past, the budgets were maybe this far apart. They're fighting over this much.
I just want to make sure that I understand completely what's on your guys' list on what you want to see. So compare our list to the governor's. We know that workers' comp is on it. We know that some sort of education reform is on it. You guys have talked about that so far today. I'm wondering what else is on it. For instance, early in the session, everybody thought that you guys were going to be making a push on family leave, but I really haven't seen any of that so far.
Here's where we're at on family leave. Every budget proposed in this town, well, there's 4 of them now actually, all suspend family leave because there's no mechanism for the state to pay for it for our employees. The Senate version goes just a little farther and says, look, we're going to study a funding source one more time, and if we can't get there, it will sunset. Because we've been at this for 6 or 7 years, we've never funded it, and I think right now funding is more likely to be directed towards education than paid family leave.
We did that bill yesterday, Senate Bill 5903. We've already passed that bill.
Okay. And it had 27 votes, I think, to do it as a, study it with a sunset so that we're not back here every 2 years doing the same old drill.
I mean, I voted for it. So, I think, as far as, we haven't funded it in 6. There's no budget out there that funds it in the next 2. If you haven't funded something in 8 years, it's time to rethink it, especially when you have a Supreme Court ruling that says your paramount duty is to fund K through 12 in an ample manner. That is going to take every ounce of revenue, ideas, whatever, reforms, that the public's going to allow out there, and so to think that there's optional dollars out there, if we thought there was easy grabs with the public, which there's not, our first obligation is education. So I think it's just a natural. After 8 years, come on, I don't think as one that actually supported it. I just think at this point in time, maybe sometime in the future we can revisit that, but at this point in time, we have to, we have to look at education funding. We have to look at the nature of our economy and make sure that we are focused on making sure we have the kind of job growth, private sector job growth, that then creates the kind of revenue that we can have the kind of government that people ideally would want.
As you're in the final budget negotiations, are you guys just open to the idea of accepting some of the revenue proposals that the House Democrats are looking at?
I don't think there's 25 votes for those proposals, or they might have been considered already. That's the difference. Our 30 members voted for a budget that didn't do any of those things. So if you have 30 members that are there, I doubt that there's 25 for that package or any significant part of it.
So are you saying that the only way to get out of here is if the House Democrats capitulate and agree to your budget?
No, the budget itself.
In terms of revenue?
Well, revenue would be very difficult to bridge that gap at this time.
I would say I don't think negotiations have begun.
Okay, just want to make it clear here, are there any other non-budget issues on your list? We talked about family leave a second ago. Anything else?
Well, there's a handful of education reforms. There's a handful of budget reforms, and then there's a handful of job creation reforms. I mean, and I think what you'll hear a lot is, we want to fix it before we fund it. And when we talk about that, we're talking about these various reforms. And we'll be sharing that list. One of the things we need to work as part of the negotiation too is sharing that list with the House and with the governor. And so we're pulling the comprehensive list together now. and kind of figuring out what the priorities are and which ones we really think should be done before we go forward.
All right, last question.
Tim Hyman filed an initiative this morning that would basically force a constitutional amendment on the 2/3 supermajority for taxes, and also make any tax increase that's passed sunset after 1 year. I'm wondering what you all think of those concepts.
They're concepts that I've just heard about today for the first time, Jim. So whether they make sense, whether they're constitutional, first time out of the chutes for me.
Could we point the mics at the Representative Alexander, who's...
Yeah, I want to say that just...
hang on to we point the mic your direction. Because
how did you get this job, Austin?
It's the public and public radio.
I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful that the initiative gets the signatures, and we basically have an opportunity for the voters to vote on that. They basically have voted for a supermajority several times, and now all we're saying is let's put it in Constitution. But I think the significant thing is today we're going to see a tax bill come forward with no referendum and an emergency clause, because they don't even want to take this to the public to support the tax package that they're willing to vote for on the floor. What are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? They've been talking all session that the public overwhelmingly supports all these tax packages for education, and yet they're not willing to take this vote to the public. So I'm hoping that that particular initiative sends a clear message that we need a supermajority.
Any concerns about the other part of the initiative that requires any taxes that are passed this year to expire in a year? Can you really run a government like that?
Well, I don't know that all the intricacies of the particular initiative. I'm more concerned about putting the 2/3 in the Constitution. So that's what I'm concerned about.
But I think the Senate showed very clearly that you can have incredible funding for McCleary, over $1 billion. You can have $1.5 billion in new educational dollars, and you can do that with no new revenue.
Well, and on top of that, the bill that we just passed out of the Senate yesterday also laid a path to generate significant long-term dollars for education over the next 2 biennia. I mean, it generates $3.5 billion of dedicated revenue to education 2 biennia out. And again, that's without new revenues. It met a lot of resistance, because the mantra around here has been, you can't do it without new revenue. You can't do it without new revenue, and I think we've shown that you can do it. And we are doing things differently than we have done in the past, just like everything, a lot of things this year are new that haven't been done in the past. So I think that that's got to be part of the discussion, and will be part of the discussion as we go into further negotiations.
Do you think if your budget or something very close to your budget with no new taxes is the final budget, that would make that initiative less popular, whereas if as Representative Alexander points out, the House budget, which has an emergency clause and no referendum possibility on taxes, would that boost the prospect for something like this?
Well, I'll say as a Democrat that I think that Frank has probably overplayed his hand on this, and that as a social moderate, people have been willing and able to vote for business-friendly Democrats, because of the social issues. Without that pocketbook protection that has been there with the 2/3 vote, I think a lot of people are going to say, wait a minute, my wallet or my social, concerns, people are going to vote with their wallet. And I think as Democrats, we've kind of overlooked that. And I think, 6 years from now, we're going to look back and say, that lawsuit might not have been our best move.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.